You may recall that the sarcomere is the functional unit of muscles. And the sliding filament theory is just the fact that those actin and myosin filaments slide past each other and the sarcomere shortens. Because we didn't have to learn about H bands and zones of overlap and I bands and A bands and that sort of thing. All we need to know is that the Z lines move closer together. And that's exactly what's happened here from the diagram of the sarcomere at rest to the sarcomere that is contracted. Overall, the sarcomere length decreases. The myofibrils shorten, the muscle fiber shortens, but the filaments do not change length. Now, what this picture is showing is that, yes, you would imagine, well, a muscle fiber, once it contracts, is going to shorten. However, in our body, one end of the muscle fiber is fixed. That is, it won't move. The other end is then going to shorten. And when they shorten, because the end of the myofilament is attached to the bone, is attached to the tendon, which is attached to the bones will move. This is pretty good in that it shows how these connective tissues, the endomysium, the perimysium, the epimysium, continue past the muscle, past these myofibrils, to become the tendon that will attach that muscle to bone. Contraction is an active process and ATP is used. But when the muscle relaxes, it is not active. It just relaxes and returns to normal by gravity, by the contraction of the opposite muscle. What structure within the muscle fiber stores and releases calcium? Sarcoplasmic reticulum. Well, muscles work in pairs. If you are going to flex your arm, and here we have a right arm that is flexed, it is the biceps brachii that contracts to flex the forearm. The muscle that works in as its pair or partner is the triceps brachii on the back of the arm. And as the biceps contracts, the triceps must relax. And just the opposite. If you're extending your arm, the triceps muscle will contract and the biceps will relax. We're going to talk a little bit here about how that myosin head, or how those filaments actually move to cause the muscle to contract. We'll start with a picture, and here we've got our myosin heads. Here's our myosin head. This is a resting cell here, so the myosin head is not cocked and ready to go. Here, ATP has been added and it is cocked and ready to go. So the contraction cycle begins when calcium ions arrive in the zone of overlap. That is, the cell is flooded with calcium, that's all. We know that there are some active sites on the actin molecule. And what calcium is going to do is expose the active sites. It does this by pulling away troponin, which locks the tropomyosin molecule in place over the active sites. Once the active sites are exposed, cross bridges can form. That is, the myosin heads can bind to the active sites on the actin. And then the myosin head pivots. The cross bridges will detach, and this requires ATP, and the myosin head will be reactivated so that it can once again attach to the actin and move it. As long as ATP and calcium are in the cell, this will continue. So the contraction cycle ends when the stimulus from the motor neuron stops. The acetylcholine is broken down by the enzyme acetylcholinesterase. There's no more action potential along the sarcolemma, and the cell has to return to normal. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum must pump the calcium back in, and everything goes back to normal. You can pause here and review the events. You can pause here and look at this diagram. A twitch is a single stimulus contraction relaxation sequence. There's a stimulus, the muscle contracts, the muscle relaxes. Every muscle type has a different duration for a twitch. Some have very quick twitches, some muscles are very quick and some are very slow. And here's a great example of two muscles and their twitch. So the stimulus is occurring here at time 0, and the eye muscle, there's a little bit of a lag, and then, because think of all the things that must happen before the muscle contracts. After the stimulus, you've got to release your calcium, you've got to bind, blah, blah, blah. So the eye twitch is extremely quick, and the deep muscle of the calf twitch is very slow. The different phases of a muscle twitch, they're not necessary. Latent is just that pause before there's action, but there's contraction and then relaxation. And there's our contraction, and there's our relaxation. Don't worry about this next part at all. We'll just skip right through it. Now you know that a single muscle is made up of thousands of muscle fibers. Remember, the fiber is the cell. Well, every single cell has to get information from a neuron. So here's a definition. A motor unit is a single neuron and all the muscle fibers that it innervates or that it sends its signal to. So learn that word, innervates. The size of the motor unit indicates precision of movement. If you want more precise movement, you'll have a smaller motor unit. That would mean that a neuron stimulates a few muscle fibers, and that's more precise. If you need, we don't use all of our muscle fibers when we contract our muscle. We may use fewer if we're lifting something lightweight, and then we need to recruit more muscle fibers if we're lifting something heavier and heavier. So we recruit by motor unit. You can see the motor units. There's an orange one, a purple one, and a blue one. So let's follow the purple. Here is a motor neuron coming from the spinal cord, and all of this one neuron innervates or stimulates all of the purple cells. Okay? Each one of these is a muscle fiber or a cell. So if you wanted to lift something lightweight, you might just use, but these are all distributed throughout the muscle. They're not like on one side of the muscle and the other side of the muscle. No, they're all mixed in together. So let's say you want to lift something lightweight like a pencil, you use the purple motor unit. If you want to lift a book, you might use purple and blue. If you want to lift a log of wood, you might use all three motor units to lift that heavier object. So as you're sitting there, your muscles are contracting whether you're aware of it or not. Some motor units are active, even when the muscle is not contracting. And this activation tenses and firms the muscle. This resting tension is called muscle tone. This entire process is subconscious, and it keeps muscles toned. Which of the following is included in a motor unit? A group of muscle fibers. There are two types of contraction, isotonic and isometric. An isotonic contraction is when you move something. So you bend your arm and you see movement as the muscle contracts. You don't have to worry about this peak tension business. Isometric is when you sit there and you tighten your abdominal muscles and you're contracting, therefore the muscle fibers are shortening, but there is no movement. So which of the following would move a load? Isotonic. Isometric, no movement. The energy source in our muscle fibers is pretty important. When you are at rest, your mitochondria are making ATP. You're not using it up. There's excess, and we can't have excess ATP hanging around. So the ATP makes creatine phosphate, which is like the storage form of ATP. Any glucose that's available will be stored in the muscle cell as glycogen. It's also stored in the liver as glycogen. So we've got this storage going on in our muscle cells. As activity increases and you need more ATP, you're going to get it aerobically as the mitochondria produce ATP. You will not become tired until you've used up all of your reserves, until you've used all the glycogen and any lipid and amino acid reserves. So here's a muscle at rest. We do have fatty acids, an energy source that can produce ATP. Glucose can produce ATP. And that extra ATP at rest is going to be stored as creatine phosphate, CP, and any excess glucose will be stored as glycogen. At moderate activity levels, let's say you're walking rapidly around the block, but you can still talk to your friend. The ATP is produced aerobically by the mitochondria. Any storage form of nutrients, the glycogen, the fatty acids, amino acids, will produce ATP in the mitochondria. But then you're running. You start running. And you cannot make enough ATP by your mitochondria. You only make about 1/3 of what you need. You're just not getting enough oxygen to the mitochondria. So you still need ATP, so we make it anaerobically, that is, without oxygen. Instead of the glucose being converted to carbon dioxide and water, the glucose just goes part way and gives us 2 ATP and is converted eventually to pyruvate, but really think of glucose going to lactic acid. It's a waste product. We get some ATP, not a lot, but it keeps us alive and keeps us running. Now that lactic acid causes our muscles to become tired. So when you're tired after exercise, you've exercised heavily and you've increased the amount of lactic acid in that muscle. And this shows the muscle at peak activity levels where you're producing lactic acid. Lactate and lactic acid are the same thing, and that's going to diffuse into the bloodstream and go back to the liver. Once it's back at the liver, it will be converted back to glucose to be used again.